There are sounds a man learns to recognize after 50 years on the same land. The creak of barnwood swelling in summer heat, the whisper of wind through Douglas fir, the crack of ice on the water trough at dawn. And then there are sounds that don't belong to any recognizable pattern. Sounds that make you stop mid-step, your hand frozen on the fence post, your breath catching in your throat like a wire pulled tight. I first heard it in October 1974. I was 28 years old, working my father's timber claim in the Cascade foothills of Washington state, 30 miles from the nearest paved road. The sound came from the old dairy barn we'd stopped using after my mother passed. A low, keening whimper that rose and fell like a question being asked over and over in a language I almost understood. My father had taught me two things about these mountains: respect what you don't understand, and never go looking for trouble with a loaded gun. So I approached the barn at sunrise with nothing but a flashlight and a canteen of water, my boots silent on the frost-brittle grass. The door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, the morning light fell in dusty columns through gaps in the roof. And there, pressed into the corner beneath the hayloft stairs, was something that would reshape the architecture of my entire life. It was small, perhaps 3 feet tall, covered in matted fur the color of wet bark. Its limbs were too long, bent at angles that seemed both canine and disturbingly human. One leg twisted beneath it at an impossible angle, clearly broken, but it was the eyes that stopped me cold. Dark, liquid, intelligent eyes that tracked my movement with the wariness of a thinking creature assessing threat and calculating survival. Not animal, not human, something that existed in the narrow, unmarked space between. I should have called the authorities. I should have contacted the Forestry Service or driven to town and reported what I'd found. Instead, I set the canteen on the ground between us, backed slowly toward the door, and began the longest conversation of my life, a dialogue conducted entirely in silence, in gestures of trust exchanged across a distance measured not in feet, but in the vast gulf between species. That was 47 years ago. His name, the sound he eventually taught me to make, was something like Kyle, and he became my responsibility, my secret, and my greatest act of faith in a world that had no language for what he was. The first weeks were an exercise in mutual fear. I would enter the barn twice daily, dawn and dusk, carrying food and water, apples from the orchard, dried venison, raw eggs still warm from the henhouse. I placed them just inside the door and retreated, never approaching, never speaking, my body language carefully neutral. He never ate while I watched. But the food disappeared, and gradually the distance between the offerings and his corner grew shorter. I used those weeks to study him with the patience my father had taught me for tracking deer. The broken leg had been set, clumsily, desperately, by something or someone before he'd arrived here. The splint was made of cedar branches bound with what looked like woven grass, the kind of field medicine that spoke of intelligence and desperation in equal measure. His fur was thicker than any wolf's, with an underlayer of fine down visible when he shifted position. His hands, I couldn't think of them as paws, had 4 fingers and an opposable thumb, each tipped with a dark, curved claw worn smooth at the edges. His feet were digitigrade, built for speed and silence, but the heel structure suggested he could stand upright when needed. I found scat near the back wall, carefully buried beneath old straw. It contained berry seeds, bits of bone, and fragments of bark, an omnivore's diet, opportunistic and adaptive. The intelligence required for such dietary flexibility was considerable. My property sat on 640 acres of mixed forest and meadow, bordered on 3 sides by federal wilderness. The nearest neighbor was 8 miles south, an elderly couple who kept to themselves. My father had chosen this isolation deliberately, seeking refuge from a world that had grown too loud, too intrusive after the war. Now that isolation became my greatest asset. I began sleeping in the barn office, a small room off the main floor with a wood stove and a cot. At night I would lie awake and listen to him move. His gait was uneven because of the injury, but even so, there was a particular grace to it, a careful placement of weight, a conscious effort to remain unheard. Sometimes I would hear him at the door testing the air, his breathing shallow and controlled. On the 18th day, I found a gift. It was placed carefully on the feed bin near where I always set his food. A perfectly intact raven's skull, cleaned and sun-bleached, positioned with the beak pointing toward my usual entrance. Among the indigenous peoples of this region, such offerings carried weight, acknowledgement, gratitude, recognition of debt. Whether he understood this cultural significance or whether it was simply instinct, I couldn't say, but I recognized the gesture for what it was. I left him a wool blanket that night, folded beside his water. By the end of the first month, his leg had healed enough for him to put weight on it. I would catch glimpses of him testing it in the pre-dawn darkness, standing on 3 legs and then tentatively lowering the 4th, wincing but determined. The resilience was remarkable, the kind of toughness born from a life where injury meant death. I started researching carefully. The local library had a surprising collection of cryptozoology texts, most donated by amateur enthusiasts over the years. I read accounts of Dogman sightings across Michigan, Wisconsin, and the Pacific Northwest, creatures described as bipedal canids with human-like characteristics. The reports were dismissed as hoaxes, misidentifications, or folktales, but the descriptions were remarkably consistent: intelligent, elusive, avoiding human contact except when threatened or desperate. What struck me most was the pattern of sightings. They clustered around areas of ecological disruption: logging operations, new highway construction, suburban expansion into wilderness areas. These weren't predators hunting humans. They were refugees, displaced and desperate, pushed into visibility by the steady encroachment of our world into theirs. The library also yielded something else: a mention, buried in a 1962 forestry report, of unidentified canid tracks found near a logging camp 15 miles north of my property. The tracks measured 17 inches long, showed evidence of an opposable digit, and were accompanied by disturbed den sites suggesting rapid abandonment. The report recommended further investigation. No follow-up was ever filed. I began to understand that Cale wasn't alone, or rather, he hadn't always been alone. Whatever family or pack structure he'd belonged to had been disrupted, scattered, or destroyed. The broken leg, the desperate flight, the choice of my barn as refuge, these weren't random. He'd been running, and he'd run out of places to hide. By mid-December, snow had closed the access road to my property. I was locked in for the winter, which suited me perfectly. The isolation became absolute. No visitors, no mail, no questions. Just the daily rhythm of survival, keeping the generator running, the stove fed, the water from freezing, and watching Cale slowly, cautiously, learn to trust. He started leaving the corner, first just to the water trough, then to the front of the barn where winter sunlight pooled on the floorboards. He would sit there, his injured leg stretched before him, and watch the snow fall through the open hayloft door. His expression, if such a word could apply, seemed contemplative, almost melancholy. Whatever he was remembering, it carried weight. I started speaking to him. Nothing elaborate, just the soft narration of my daily tasks. Splitting wood today, going to be cold tonight, found a hawk's nest in the North 40, eggs frozen in the shell. I didn't expect understanding, but I'd spent enough time alone to know that the sound of a voice, any voice, could be a comfort against the enormous silence of winter. One evening in late January, I entered the barn to find him standing upright, balanced carefully on his healing leg. He was perhaps 5.5 feet tall in this posture, his spine slightly curved, his arms hanging at an angle that split the difference between human and canine. He watched me with those liquid dark eyes, and then, very deliberately, he tilted his head in acknowledgement. Not submission, not fear, recognition, the acknowledgement of one thinking being to another. I nodded back, and the contract between us was sealed. Spring came late that year, the snow holding until April before finally releasing its grip. With the thaw came new complications. The access road reopened, the mail resumed, and with it, questions. Tom Brewster, the county forestry agent, showed up on a warm morning in May, his truck rattling up the muddy road with a purposefulness that set my nerves on edge. Tom was a good man, a veteran like my father, someone who understood the value of privacy. But he was also thorough, and he didn't make social calls. "Got a report," he said, stepping out of the truck and adjusting his hat against the sun. Hiker claimed he heard unusual vocalizations coming from this direction last fall, before the snow. "Some kind of distress call," he said. "Animal welfare concern." I kept my expression neutral, my body language relaxed. "Lots of sounds in these woods, Tom. Could have been a cougar. They scream like murder when they're in season." "That's what I figured," he said. But his eyes were scanning the property, cataloging the barn, the tree line, the subtle paths worn through the grass. "Mind if I take a look around? Just for the report." I did mind, desperately, but refusing would raise more suspicion than allowing it. "Help yourself." I said. "I've got coffee on if you want some after." He walked the perimeter, checking the barn from outside, peering through gaps in the boards. Cale, I knew, was hidden in the root cellar beneath the office, a space I'd discovered and prepared for exactly this scenario. The entrance was concealed beneath a pile of old tack, the air holes disguised as drainage. It wasn't comfortable, but it was invisible. Tom spent 20 minutes on his inspection, then accepted the coffee. We sat on the porch and talked about logging rights, the new housing development going in 40 miles south, the steady creep of civilization into wilderness. His frustration was genuine. Like many who'd spent their lives in these forests, he could see what was being lost. "Sometimes I wonder if we're going to push everything out," he said, staring into his mug. "The elk are already moving higher. The bear population's down 30% in the last decade. Makes you think about what might be out there we haven't even documented yet, what we might lose before we even know it existed." The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. I wanted to tell him, wanted to show him that his fears were justified, that there were indeed things in these forests that science hadn't cataloged. But the urge to confess was overwhelmed by the deeper responsibility I'd taken on. Kyle's survival depended on silence. After Tom left, I sat in the barn and considered my situation with new clarity. I couldn't hide Cale forever. Eventually, someone would see something, hear something, find evidence that couldn't be explained away. And when that happened, the consequences wouldn't be a simple forestry report. I'd been a radio operator in Vietnam, and I'd maintained those contacts over the years. Other veterans scattered across the country who'd learned to trust each other more than they trusted institutions. Through them, I heard things, rumors, stories that never made the papers, discussions of military research into cryptid species, mentions of collection protocols for biological anomalies. The language was always vague, bureaucratic, designed to obscure rather than illuminate. But the message was clear. There were people actively looking for exactly what I was hiding, and they had resources I couldn't begin to match. That summer, I started preparing in earnest. I expanded the root cellar, installing better ventilation and a water supply. I created alternate hiding spots throughout the property, hollow spaces beneath stacked timber, cavities in the rock formations to the north. I taught Cale the warning signs, the sound of vehicles on the road, the distant chop of helicopter rotors, the particular cadence of radio chatter. He learned quickly. His intelligence was undeniable now. He understood cause and effect, recognized patterns, adapted to new situations with a flexibility that suggested not just instinct but reasoning. He'd started attempting communication beyond gestures, soft vocalizations that seemed deliberately shaped, attempts at mimicking the rhythm of human speech. The sounds weren't words exactly, but they carried intention, meaning encoded in pitch and duration. We developed a system. 1 low sound meant danger, 2 meant all clear, 3 meant he needed something, food, water, attention to an injury. It was primitive, but it worked, and it confirmed what I'd come to understand. Kyle wasn't a clever animal. He was a person trapped in a form the world refused to acknowledge. By autumn, our routine had solidified. He spent daylight hours in hiding, emerging only at dusk when the light softened and the forest came alive with its own sounds. We would walk the property together, him moving through the shadows with practiced silence, me providing cover if needed. He showed me things I'd never noticed. Game trails used only at specific times, medicinal plants growing in unexpected places, the territorial markers of other predators. His knowledge of this ecosystem was profound, intuitive, born from generations of coexistence rather than study. But there were also moments of profound sadness. Sometimes he would stop at the edge of the property, staring north into the deep wilderness, his body rigid with longing. He would make a sound, a low, mournful vocalization that carried across the valley like a question shouted into emptiness, and the forest never answered. He was alone. Whatever others of his kind had been here, they were gone now, scattered, dead, or so deeply hidden that even their own couldn't find them. In those moments, I understood the true weight of what I'd taken on. I wasn't just protecting him from the world. I was bearing witness to a kind of loneliness so complete it had no human parallel. He was the last of something, and I was his only connection to anything resembling companionship. It was a responsibility I carried with equal parts reverence and dread. The impossible became undeniable on an October evening in 1979, 5 years after I'd first found Cale in the barn. I'd seen him countless times by then, tending his injuries, watching him heal, observing his movements and behaviors. But familiarity had bred a kind of comfortable acceptance, a gradual normalization of the extraordinary. He'd become part of the landscape of my life, remarkable but routine. That changed the night I saw him as he truly was. I'd been repairing fence line in the north pasture when evening fell faster than expected, the autumn sun dropping behind the ridgeline and plunging the forest into premature darkness. Rather than fumble my way back in blackness, I decided to wait for the moon, settling against a fallen cedar to watch the sky transition from deep blue to star-scattered black. That's when I heard it, a sound I'd never encountered before. Not Cale's usual vocalizations, but something else. A response. It came from deep in the wilderness to the north, carried on the wind. A long, modulated call that rose and fell with complex patterning. It wasn't random. It was language. Communication structured with syntax and purpose, even if I couldn't understand the meaning. And then I heard Cale answer. He'd emerged from the tree line 50 yards from my position, unaware of my presence. In the moonlight, he stood fully upright, his head tilted back, his chest expanding as he produced a series of sounds that matched the pattern of the distant call. The vocalizations were rich with overtones, simultaneously guttural and melodic, shaped by a vocal apparatus capable of nuances human speech couldn't replicate. They called back and forth for nearly 10 minutes, two voices in the darkness, negotiating some exchange I could only guess at. Territory, warning, reunion. The emotional content was clear even without comprehension. Urgency, caution, something that might have been hope. And then Cale did something that reconstructed my understanding of everything I thought I knew. He moved into the moonlit clearing, and there, using his hands and body in deliberate, structured movements, he began to communicate visually. His gestures were precise, repeated with variations that suggested meaning. He pointed north, made a sweeping motion with his arm, touched his chest and then indicated the ground, created shapes in the air that seemed to represent numbers or quantities. It was sign language. Not human sign language, but a system of visual communication sophisticated enough to convey complex abstract concepts. And whoever, whatever, was out there in the darkness, was watching, understanding, responding with their own calls that shifted in tone and pattern. I sat frozen, barely breathing, watching something no human was meant to witness. This wasn't animal behavior. This was culture. Communication between members of a species with shared language, shared meaning, shared understanding, passed down through some unbroken chain of knowledge. The exchange lasted perhaps 20 minutes before the distant caller fell silent. Kyle remained standing in the clearing, his posture gradually shifting from urgency to something like resignation. When he finally moved, it was slowly, heavily, back toward the shelter of the trees. He saw me then. Our eyes met across the distance, and in his expression I recognized something profound: embarrassment. Or perhaps violation, the sense of privacy breached, of being observed in a moment of vulnerability. I remained still, giving him space. After a long moment, he made the soft vocalization we'd established as all clear and disappeared into the forest. I didn't follow. Instead, I sat with what I'd witnessed, trying to process the implications. Cale wasn't alone. Others existed, somewhere in the vast wilderness to the north, but they weren't, or couldn't, come here. The communication had the quality of exile and separation, of distance enforced by circumstance rather than choice. That night, back in the barn office, I made notes for the first time since Cale's arrival. Not detailed records, the risk of discovery was too great, but simple observations, things I needed to externalize to believe. They have language, complex, structured communication. They have culture, shared systems of meaning. They are aware of their own isolation. They are capable of abstract thought, planning, emotional complexity. They are people. The word felt simultaneously accurate and inadequate. People implied recognition, rights, protection under law, but law required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would mean exposure. And exposure, I increasingly understood, would mean destruction. Over the following weeks, the calls continued intermittently. Always at night, always brief, always with that quality of careful distance. Cal would respond, and I would witness these exchanges from whatever shadow I could find, piecing together what understanding I could. What emerged was a picture of a species in extremis, scattered, cautious, maintaining contact across vast distances but unable or unwilling to congregate. The fragmentation wasn't cultural. It was survival strategy. Smaller numbers meant less evidence, less risk of detection. They'd learned to live as ghosts, appearing in consciousness only as myth and rumor, real enough to persist but nebulous enough to be dismissed. The tragedy of it was staggering. An entire species forced into evolutionary hiding. Their population fragmented to the point where breeding viability must be approaching critical thresholds. Their culture reduced to long-distance calls in the darkness, and whatever memories could be preserved without physical gathering. And I was complicit in that isolation. By hiding Kale, I'd kept him safe, but I'd also severed him from whatever remained of his kind. The others couldn't come here. My presence, my property, the roads and power lines and all the infrastructure of human occupation made it too dangerous. And Kale couldn't go to them. His injury, his long recovery, had cost him the strength and endurance necessary for deep wilderness survival. He was caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. That revelation, watching him call into the darkness and receiving only careful, distant responses, broke something in me. The weight of responsibility I'd carried with such conviction suddenly seemed insufficient. I hadn't saved him. I'd trapped him in a different kind of isolation, arguably worse than what I'd rescued him from, because loneliness is most acute when you can see what you're missing, and every call in the darkness was a reminder of the life he couldn't return to. The decision to document Kale's existence came not from courage but from the growing certainty that silence itself was a kind of betrayal. It was December 1982, 8 years into our strange cohabitation, when I finally broke my self-imposed rule and committed what I knew to paper. Not casual notes, but detailed documentation, physical measurements, behavioral observations, dietary patterns, communication attempts. I photographed him, carefully with his apparent consent, using an old Nikon with black and white film I developed myself in the barn's makeshift darkroom. The photographs were devastating in their clarity. They showed unambiguously that Kale was neither bear nor wolf, neither deformed human nor hoax. He was exactly what he appeared to be, a species unknown to science, intelligent and self-aware, caught in the frame with an expression that could only be described as patient resignation. I stored the documentation in a fireproof box buried in the root cellar. My intention wasn't publication. I couldn't imagine any scenario where revealing Kale's existence would end well for him. But I needed the evidence to exist. Some testament that this had happened, that he had lived, that I hadn't imagined the most important relationship of my life. The ethical vertigo was constant. Every day I maintained his secret. I was withholding information that could reshape humanity's understanding of its place in the natural world. Every day I kept him hidden. I was potentially allowing others of his kind to die unknown, unprotected, unmourned. The weight of that knowledge ground against my conscience like stone against stone. But the alternative was worse. I'd begun researching what happened when unknown species were discovered. The pattern was depressingly consistent. Initial sensation, scientific fervor, followed by either aggressive conservation that destroyed the species' habitat with protection or outright exploitation. The coelacanth, rediscovered after millions of years, immediately became a trophy target. New primate species encountered in remote jungles faced immediate habitat destruction, as researchers and tourists flooded previously isolated areas, and those were animals without demonstrated intelligence, without language, without the capacity to be seen as competitors or threats. What would happen when the world learned of a bipedal, tool-using intelligent species that had successfully evaded human detection for centuries? The optimistic scenario was invasive study, habitat seizure, likely captivity, for their own protection. The pessimistic scenario was military interest, biological weapons research, and systematic elimination under the guise of national security. I'd seen how institutions operated. During the war, I'd transmitted messages about civilian casualties that were later denied, watched reports of atrocities disappear into bureaucratic memory holes, seen the gap between official narrative and boots-on-ground reality grow into a chasm wide enough to swallow truth entirely. The same apparatus that could make a massacre disappear could certainly erase evidence of an inconvenient species. So I said nothing, and the silence became its own kind of poison. Kale seemed to sense my turmoil. His intelligence had grown more evident over the years, not because he'd changed, but because I'd learned to recognize it. He understood not just immediate cause and effect, but long-term consequence. He recognized my moods, responded to my anxiety with what could only be described as concern. Once, during a period of particular anguish, he'd placed his hand, careful, gentle, on my shoulder, and made a soft sound that translated unmistakably as reassurance. The touch was electric. His palm was warm, textured with fine fur over calloused pads, the strength in it obvious but controlled. In that moment, the full weight of his personhood was undeniable. I wasn't hiding an animal. I was harboring a refugee. But from what? And with what right? The calls from the north had become less frequent over the years. Sometimes months would pass in silence. When they did come, they carried a quality of desperation that tore at something fundamental. Cale's responses became increasingly urgent, his gestures more emphatic, and the silences that followed lasted longer, heavier, filled with what I could only interpret as grief. I started driving to nearby towns, visiting libraries in counties far enough away that my questions wouldn't raise local suspicion. I researched land use changes in the Cascades, logging rights transfers, wilderness area designations. What I found was grimly predictable: systematic habitat reduction, the steady encroachment of human infrastructure into previously untouched wilderness. Between 1975 and 1983, over 400,000 acres of old-growth forest in the Pacific Northwest had been logged. Road construction had penetrated areas that had never seen mechanized access. The quiet, deep wilderness that species like Cale's required for survival was being carved into progressively smaller fragments, islands of forest separated by clear cuts and highways and the spreading stain of development. The others weren't coming because they were dying, or fleeing further into the diminishing wild, or fragmenting into populations so small and isolated that extinction was less a possibility than an inevitability. And Cale knew. I saw it in the way he listened to the forest, in his increasing reluctance to vocalize even when calls came. He was witnessing the slow erasure of his species from consciousness and from reality, watching the world forget them, even as they still lived. My documentation became an archive of extinction. I photographed not just Cale but the forest itself, the old growth stands, the game trails, the undisturbed spaces that represented not just ecosystem but culture, the physical context in which an entire form of consciousness had evolved. I was creating evidence for a future that might never care, testimony to a loss that would never be acknowledged. At night, I would sit with the photographs spread before me and wonder what historians would think if they ever surfaced. Would they believe? Or would they assume hoax, clever manipulation, the desperate fiction of an isolated man who'd spent too long alone? The terrible irony was that the very isolation protecting Cale also undermined any evidence of his existence. Who would believe the sole testimony of a recluse living in the mountains with no corroboration, no peer review, no institutional backing? The truth was too extraordinary, and I was too unreliable a witness. So I did the only thing I could. I continued the daily work of maintenance and care, ensuring that at least one member of his species would survive, would be safe, would live out his years with dignity, and whatever piece could be salvaged from exile. It wasn't enough, but it was all I had to offer. The understanding came not through revelation, but through accumulation, small observations that finally cohered into inescapable truth. It was late spring 1985. Cale had been with me for 11 years. His leg, long since healed, retained only a slight stiffness in cold weather. He moved through the forest with confidence now, his movements economical and precise, the embodiment of adapted intelligence. But there were changes I couldn't ignore. His fur, once uniformly dark, had developed threads of gray around the muzzle and chest. His movements, while still graceful, carried a deliberate quality they hadn't possessed before, the kind of consciousness that comes with aging, where the body's limitations become part of every calculation. He slept more, moved less, and the calls from the north, when they came at all, seemed to cause him more distress than comfort. I'd been so focused on protecting him that I'd failed to consider the most basic question: what was I protecting him for? He was aging. He would die, and when he did, whatever unique knowledge he carried, his language, his culture, his understanding of the forest and his species, would disappear with him. I'd saved one life, but failed to preserve anything beyond that life's immediate duration. The weight of this realization was crushing. One evening in June, I sat with him in the barn as rain hammered the roof. He was grooming himself, a lengthy process involving careful attention to fur, claws, and the spaces between his digits. The ritual had a meditative quality, Something performed for comfort as much as hygiene. I'd brought my notebook, the one I'd kept hidden for years, and I made a decision. I need to understand, I said aloud, though I knew he couldn't comprehend the words. What you need, what I can do that actually matters. He paused in his grooming, his dark eyes turning to me, with that particular intensity that suggested not just awareness, but comprehension of intent, if not content. I opened the notebook to a blank page and drew. Simple shapes at first, circle, square, triangle. He watched with what seemed like curiosity. Then I drew a stick figure of a human, pointed to myself, then drew another figure attempting to capture his proportions. The digitigrade legs, the elongated arms, the particular posture of his spine. He went very still. I pointed to the second figure, then to him. His eyes moved between the drawing and my face, something shifting in his expression. Recognition? Understanding that I was attempting communication through visual representation? Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached out and took the pencil from my hand. His grip was awkward, the pencil small and fragile in his large fingers, but purposeful. He bent over the notebook, his movements careful and measured. What he drew wasn't representational art, but something else. Symbols, repeated marks that carried the structure of writing even though they weren't letters. Groups of marks separated by space. Patterns that suggested syntax, meaning encoded in position and relationship. He worked for several minutes, his concentration absolute, then pushed the notebook back to me. I stared at the page. There were perhaps 24 distinct symbols, some repeated, arranged in what appeared to be sentences or phrases. The meaning was opaque, but the intention was devastating in its clarity. He was literate. His species had writing. Kyle, I whispered, and my voice broke on the name. He made a soft vocalization and touched the page with one claw tip, then looked at me with an expression I'd learned to read. It meant, "Do you understand?" I understood that I understood nothing, that every assumption I'd made about the limits of his species' culture had been wrong, that their isolation hadn't prevented the development of complex abstraction, symbolic thought, recorded knowledge. They had language, they had writing. They had somewhere in the diminishing wilderness a history preserved in forms I couldn't begin to imagine. And I had one survivor sitting in a barn in Washington state, using the last of his strength to try to communicate across a gap so vast that even the attempt seemed tragic. Over the following weeks, we established new protocols. He would draw symbols. I would attempt to associate them with objects, actions, concepts. It was painstaking, often unsuccessful, but gradually patterns emerged. A particular mark seemed to indicate danger. Another appeared in context suggesting negation or absence. A third seemed to function as a question marker. What emerged wasn't translation, but something more fundamental. Proof of method. Proof that meaning could be shared, that the gap between our species wasn't insurmountable, that understanding, however imperfect, was possible, but it also revealed the depth of what was being lost. Every symbol Kale shared represented knowledge without context, vocabulary without grammar, cultural artifacts divorced from the culture that created them. He could show me the words, but he couldn't explain the stories they were meant to tell. He was a library with no way to teach someone to read. One afternoon, he led me deep into the forest, moving with particular purposefulness. We hiked for over an hour, reaching a section of old growth I'd rarely visited. There, on the trunk of a massive cedar easily 6 feet in diameter, were marks. They'd been made with claws, carved deep into the bark years ago, and since healed over with sap and new growth, but they were still visible. The same symbols Kale had drawn in my notebook, arranged in vertical columns, weathered but deliberate. Territory markers, historical record, sacred text. I couldn't know which, or if the distinction even existed in their cultural framework, but the message was clear. Others had been here, had lived here, had left evidence of their existence in the one medium that couldn't be easily destroyed or denied. Kyle placed his hand on the scarred bark, his expression unreadable. Then he made a sound I'd never heard before, a low, sustained vocalization that carried the weight of mourning. It was the sound of someone saying goodbye to everything they'd known, standing witness to the evidence that they'd once belonged to something larger than isolation. I understood then what I'd failed to grasp in 11 years. He wasn't just hiding from the world. He was protecting what remained of his species from the world. Every day he stayed silent. Every call he didn't answer. Every instinct toward reunion he suppressed. was an act of calculated preservation. He was choosing extinction in obscurity over discovery and destruction, and I had been helping him make that choice without fully understanding what it cost. The helicopters came on a Tuesday morning in September 1986, low and fast enough to rattle the windows. I'd expected something eventually. For 12 years, I'd maintained vigilance, developed contingencies, prepared for the inevitable breach, but when it finally arrived, the scale of it still shocked me. There were 4 helicopters, military Hueys, the distinctive whump of their rotors unmistakable from my war years. They swept the property in a coordinated pattern suggesting intelligence-driven operation, not random search. They knew, or suspected enough that the distinction didn't matter. I had perhaps 10 minutes. Kyle was already in motion when I reached the barn. He'd heard them before I had, recognized the threat with instincts honed over more than a decade of hiding. He was heading for the North Forest, moving with the intention of disappearing into wilderness and never returning. I caught his arm. He turned, and in his eyes I saw not fear, but resignation. This moment had always been coming. We both knew it. "Wait," I said, though I knew he didn't understand English beyond a handful of associations. "Please, wait." He paused. Whatever communication we'd developed over the years, whatever trust had been built, it held. He waited. The helicopters landed in the south meadow, kicking up dust and dead grass. I walked toward them with my hands visible, my posture deliberately non-threatening. Behind me, Kyle melted into the barn's shadows. I didn't look back. The less attention directed toward the barn, the better. 6 men emerged from the helicopters. Not soldiers, at least not obviously military despite the aircraft. They wore civilian clothes, carried equipment that looked scientific rather than tactical, moved with the organized purposefulness of people operating under clear protocols. But the undertone of authority was unmistakable. The leader was a man in his 50s, gray hair, military short, wire-rimmed glasses catching the morning light. He approached with an extended hand and a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Garrett? Dr. James Sullivan, Department of Interior, Wildlife Assessment Division." The title was carefully bureaucratic, designed to sound legitimate while revealing nothing. "We'd like to ask you some questions." "About what?" I kept my voice level, curious but not defensive. "We've been tracking unusual biological markers in this region for several years. Ground sensors, audio analysis, pattern recognition. The data suggests this property might be relevant to our investigation." Ground sensors. They'd been monitoring the property, probably for months or years. Every step Kyle had taken outside, every vocalization, every thermal signature had potentially been recorded. The surveillance net had been drawing tighter without my knowledge. "I'm not sure what you're looking for," I said, "but you're welcome to look around. I've got nothing to hide." It was a calculated risk. Refusing access would confirm suspicion. But Kale was smart, experienced, capable of remaining undetected for hours or days if necessary. The hiding places we'd prepared over the years were sophisticated. Not just spaces, but scent management, thermal dampening, multiple exit routes. If he stayed calm, stayed hidden, we might still salvage this. Sullivan gestured to his team. They dispersed with professional efficiency, some moving toward the barn, others heading for the forest with handheld equipment that looked like thermal imaging and audio collection gear. Sullivan remained with me, his questions casual, conversational, probing. "How long have you lived here alone?" "Since my father passed. 15 years. Ever notice anything unusual? Strange sounds? Unexpected animal behavior?" "It's the wilderness, Doctor. Everything's unusual until you learn the patterns." His smile tightened. "Cryptozoology isn't my specialty, Mr. Garrett. I'm not looking for Bigfoot stories. I'm interested in genuine biological anomalies, species that might have evaded formal documentation, and I think you might have information relevant to that interest." The directness was startling. He wasn't playing games, wasn't hiding behind bureaucratic language. He knew, or had enough evidence that he could afford to be direct. "If such a species existed," I said carefully, "what would happen to it?" "That would depend entirely on the circumstances. Conservation status, habitat requirements, risk assessment. Our job is protection, not exploitation. With all respect, Doctor, your job is classification. You want to know what it is, where it is, how many exist. What happens after that depends on people who don't care about protection." Something shifted in his expression. Not anger, but recognition. "You've done this calculus already. You've thought through every scenario. And you've decided that silence is safer than disclosure. I'm not saying anything exists. You're not saying it doesn't. We stood in silence, two men negotiating around a truth neither could explicitly acknowledge. The real conversation wasn't about evidence or confirmation. It was about trust, and I had absolutely none to offer. His team worked for 3 hours. They examined the barn, swept the forest, deployed their sensors and cameras. They found evidence. I'd known they would. Footprints too large for any known species. Claw marks on trees that didn't match bear or cougar. Hair samples that would defy easy categorization. But they didn't find KL. When they finally departed, Sullivan handed me a business card. Plain white stock, simple black text, a phone number with a Washington, D.C. area code. If circumstances change, he said, if you decide that disclosure is preferable to indefinite isolation, call me. We can discuss options, protections, legal frameworks that might address your concerns. And if I don't, then we continue monitoring, continue gathering evidence, and eventually we'll have enough to justify a more extensive investigation, one that won't be as polite. He paused, his expression softening slightly. I'm not the enemy, Mr. Garrett. I've spent my career studying species on the edge of extinction. I understand the impulse to protect, but isolation isn't preservation. It's just a slower form of extinction. The helicopters lifted off, their rotors hammering the air, the sound gradually fading as they disappeared south. I stood in the silence they left behind, Sullivan's card heavy in my pocket, and wondered if he was right. Kyle emerged an hour later from a hiding spot 200 yards north, concealed in a cavity beneath a fallen cedar. He'd waited, patient and still, while strangers searched for him. When our eyes met, his expression asked the question I'd been asking myself. How much longer could this possibly last? The decision was mine to make, but the weight of it belonged to both of us. For days after the helicopters, I couldn't settle. I'd drive to town for supplies and find myself sitting in the truck for hours, staring at Sullivan's card, playing out scenarios that all ended badly. Disclosure meant study, documentation, the transformation of a person into a specimen. Continued silence meant living under surveillance, watching the noose tighten until eventually, inevitably, they found what they were looking for. And Cale would spend whatever time remained in hiding, cut off from any others who might still exist, aging in isolation until one day, he simply stopped. Neither option was acceptable, but those were the only options available. I found him one evening in early October, sitting at the forest edge where the property met true wilderness. The aspens had turned gold, their leaves trembling in the wind, and the air carried the first sharp edge of coming winter. He was staring north as he often did, his posture suggesting listening rather than looking. I sat beside him, didn't speak, just shared the silence. After a long while, he made a soft vocalization, not language, just acknowledgement of presence. Then he did something he'd never done before. He placed his hand on the ground between us, palm up, an unmistakable gesture of offering. I placed my hand over his. The fur was soft, the palm warm, the strength evident but gentled. We sat like that as the sun set, two beings from different species, different worlds, connected by nothing more than circumstance and choice, and the profound stubbornness of care. And I understood what he was telling me, not in words, but in the deeper grammar of intention. Whatever you decide, I accept. The trust in that gesture was devastating. He was placing his survival, his future, his life in my judgment. Not because he lacked agency, but because he recognized that the human world was mine to navigate in ways he couldn't. He'd evaded detection for 12 years, but he couldn't evade forever, and he knew it. That night I made the call. Sullivan answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the late hour. Mr. Garrett, I need guarantees, I said. Legal protections, written into binding agreements. Habitat preservation, restrictions on access, protocols that prioritize well-being over research. And I need them before any disclosure happens. What exactly are we protecting? A species that survived through invisibility, that's learned the hard way that human contact means extinction, that has culture, language, and intelligence that we have no framework for recognizing, much less protecting. The silence stretched. Then, you're not speculating. No. How many? One. That I can verify. Maybe others in the deep wilderness, but fragmented, isolated, possibly below viable breeding populations. What I can offer is documentation, evidence, and access to an individual who's lived in proximity to humans long enough to potentially serve as ambassador might be the word, if such a thing is even possible. Mr. Garrett, do you understand what you're suggesting? The implications would be massive, yes, which is why I've spent 12 years saying nothing. But silence isn't working. The habitat is shrinking. The surveillance is increasing, and eventually someone less careful than me will find what you're looking for, and the discovery won't be on terms that serve anyone's interests. Another pause. I'll need to consult with colleagues, develop a preliminary framework. This isn't something I can authorize alone. You have 1 week. After that, I disappear, he disappears, and you'll never verify any of this existed. Understood. I'll be in touch. I hung up and sat in the darkness, wondering if I'd just saved Cale's life or signed his death warrant. The days that followed were surreal. I continued the daily routines, chores, maintenance, the comfortable patterns of survival, but everything was underlaid with waiting, with the awareness that I'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. Cale knew something had changed. His behavior shifted, more vigilant, more restless. He spent hours at the property line, listening to the forest, perhaps trying to detect whether others could sense what was coming. On the 5th day, Sullivan called. We have a proposal, preliminary framework, pending verification of your claims, federal wilderness designation for 50,000 acres surrounding your property, restricted access for scientific purposes only, with review boards including representatives from indigenous communities and conservation organizations, legal recognition of, let's call them non-human persons of interest, with protections equivalent to endangered species status. That's paper, I said. What about enforcement? 24-hour perimeter monitoring. Anyone attempting unauthorized access faces federal prosecution, and before you ask, yes, that includes military and intelligence services. This goes above their clearance. It was better than I'd hoped, which made me suspicious. What's the catch? Documentation. We need evidence sufficient to justify the designation. Photographs, tissue samples for DNA analysis, behavioral observation, and direct interaction, not capture, not restraint, but documented proof of intelligence, language, culture, proof that we're not just preserving an animal but protecting a thinking, feeling being with inherent rights. He's not a research subject. No, he's a collaborator, if he chooses to be. Everything happens with consent, as much as consent can be established across species lines. You'll be present throughout. You'll have veto power over any protocol you deem harmful. I closed my eyes. It was more than I'd thought possible, but it was still a bargain with institutions I didn't trust, protections that could be revoked, promises written in the kind of language that could be interpreted away by future administrations. I need to discuss it with him. Of course. Take whatever time you need. I found Kyle in the barn, sitting in the corner that had been his first refuge 12 years ago. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. We'd come full circle, from wounded stranger hiding from the world to deliberate choice about engagement with it. I sat across from him and pulled out my notebook, drew 2 figures, us, as I'd done before, then drew more figures, humans surrounding us, but at a distance, sketched trees, lots of them, filling the page, then drew a fence around it all. He studied the drawing, his eyes moving between the images, processing. Then he reached for the pencil and added something, a single mark. The symbol I'd learned meant question. He was asking, is this possible? I drew a question mark beside his symbol. I was asking, do you want this? He looked at me for a long moment. Then he placed his hand over mine, pressed down gently, and made the vocalization that had come to mean affirmation. Yes. Not because he trusted institutions or believed in legal protections, but because he trusted me, and because living in fear, even safe, was its own kind of death. They came in November, just before the first snow. Not helicopters this time, but a small convoy of vehicles moving slowly up the access road. Sullivan, 2 other scientists, a legal observer, and a documentary crew shooting footage that would remain classified for decades. I met them at the gate, Cale beside me. He'd chosen to stand upright, presenting himself fully, his posture neither submissive nor aggressive, just present, himself, undeniable. The reaction from the scientists was everything I'd hoped and feared. Shock, yes. Wonder, absolutely. But also immediate clinical assessment, measuring his height with their eyes, noting the proportion of his limbs, the structure of his hands, already cataloging him into taxonomy. Sullivan stepped forward slowly, his hands visible and empty. "May I approach?" I looked at Cale. He tilted his head, the gesture we'd established for acknowledgement, and remained still. Sullivan came within 6 feet and stopped. "My name is James," he said, speaking slowly, clearly. "I'm honored to meet you." Cale studied him with those dark, intelligent eyes. Then he made a deliberate vocalization, 3 distinct sounds, carefully articulated. His name, or as close as his vocal apparatus could render it in a form humans might reproduce. Sullivan's breath caught. "Cale," a single sound. Affirmation. And in that moment, the entire framework shifted. This wasn't discovery. It was first contact, the recognition that another intelligence existed in our world, had always existed, had been here long before roads and property lines and all the infrastructure we'd laid across the landscape like a net. The documentation process took 3 weeks. Cale participated with what seemed like weary patience, allowing photographs, submitting to non-invasive physical examination, demonstrating his language through repeated interactions. The scientists were respectful, I'll give them that. They worked within the boundaries he established, backed off when his body language indicated discomfort, never pushed beyond what he offered freely. The tissue samples showed DNA that was startlingly close to human, closer than chimpanzees, close enough to suggest a common ancestor in the relatively recent evolutionary past. The vocal analysis revealed a larynx structure capable of producing sounds across a broader frequency range than human speech. The cognitive testing, conducted through careful observation rather than formal examination, showed problem-solving abilities, tool use, and abstract reasoning consistent with human intelligence. But it was the writing that convinced them. When Cale was given materials, he produced symbols identical to those I'd documented from the forest, and when shown photographs of similar markings from other locations, evidence other researchers had collected over decades but dismissed as natural patterns or hoaxes, he could distinguish authentic writing from misidentification with perfect accuracy. He wasn't unique. His species had developed literacy independently of human contact. They had culture, history, knowledge systems that existed entirely outside human awareness. And all of it was disappearing, fragmented into isolated individuals scattered across diminishing wilderness, dying in silence. The federal designation went through with surprising speed. 50,000 acres became protected wilderness, off-limits to development, accessible only through permits reviewed by a board that included indigenous tribal representatives, conservation scientists, and, though his role was never formally acknowledged, me. Cale remained on my property. The agreement specified that he couldn't be relocated without consent, and consent was something he clearly had the capacity to grant or withhold. He'd chosen to stay, and that choice was respected. But the isolation changed. With protected wilderness to the north and reduced human pressure, the calls began again. First tentative, then more frequent. Others were responding, carefully testing whether the territory had become safe enough for contact. I witnessed the first reunion in January, 2 months after the designation. Kyle went north at dusk, moving with purpose I hadn't seen in years. I followed at a distance, staying within sight but giving him space. The clearing where they met was small, surrounded by old growth cedar. There were 2 others, one slightly larger than Cale, one smaller. They approached each other with caution that gradually dissolved into what could only be described as joy. They touched hands, pressed foreheads together, made vocalizations that rose and fell with the complexity of conversation too rapid for me to parse. They were speaking, sharing, reconnecting after years of isolation. And I realized that whatever protection we'd established, whatever legal frameworks we'd built, they were meaningless compared to this, the simple fact of not being alone. Kyle turned and saw me watching. Our eyes met across the distance. He raised one hand, not in warning or dismissal, but in acknowledgement. Then he turned back to his companions, and they disappeared together into the forest. He returned at dawn, but something fundamental had changed. He wasn't hiding anymore. He had somewhere to go, someone to be with. The barn became a waypoint rather than a prison, a place he visited rather than a place he was trapped. Over the following months, signs of others began appearing, tracks crossing the property, markings on trees at the boundary line, occasionally distant figures visible at the forest edge at dusk. They were reclaiming territory, cautiously testing the protection, learning to exist in proximity to humans under new terms. I'm 74 now. Kale is somewhere in his 30s. We've never been able to determine his age with precision. He visits less frequently, which I consider success. He has family now, or community, or whatever social structure his species maintains. He's living the life his kind evolved to live rather than existing in exile. The documentation remains classified. The public doesn't know, and perhaps never will. The official story is conservation of critical habitat for endangered species, which is true, just not the whole truth. Some secrets are kept not to deceive, but to protect, to give the vulnerable time to find their footing before the full weight of human attention falls on them. Sometimes I sit on the porch at dusk and watch the tree line. If I'm patient, I might catch a glimpse of movement, a shadow that doesn't match the pattern of wildlife I've learned over 50 years. And occasionally, very rarely, I hear it. The call in the darkness, not desperate now, but almost conversational, answered by others from various directions. They're still here, still hidden, but by choice now rather than desperate necessity. Still cautious, but no longer alone. And I think about Sullivan's words. Isolation isn't preservation. It's just a slower form of extinction. He was right. But preservation isn't revelation either. It's the careful maintenance of space where difference can exist, without being consumed by curiosity or transformed into spectacle. Some knowledge changes the world, and sometimes the most profound act of wisdom is knowing what to keep silent, what to protect, and what to reveal only to those who understand that discovery carries responsibility. The forest still holds its secrets, but now they're held with permission, with protection, with the recognition that not everything unknown needs to be made known. Some mysteries deserve to remain mysteries, not because we fear the truth, but because we respect it enough to let it exist on its own terms.